Well, we are in a series called Throwback, and we're looking at ancient wisdom for a modern world and how we can apply it to our lives. And today we're looking specifically at ancient wisdom from the book of Proverbs on the topic of leadership. And we'll talk about how that applies to each of us and what this means for our lives. But first, we've got to throw back to something a little less ancient, and that is the fantastic decade of the 1980s. And I'm kind of partial to the 80s because my wife was born in the 80s. And so I think very highly of these. I was too, but I like her more than me. So, and everybody else likes her more than me too, so it's okay. We're going to use Melissa as the 80s. We're talking about the 80s today, and I'm going to need a little audience participation because I need to see how well you know your 1980s leaders. And so I'm going to describe two leaders, and we're going to have a little guessing period, so you might need to focus in. Okay, the 1980s gave us one of the most iconic leadership duos of all time. Father-son duo, they actually pop up in the late 1970s, but really come to dominance and come to power throughout the 1980s. Father-son, the father and the son could not have been more different. The father led through intimidation. He led through fear. The father was famous for intimidating his subordinates, for threatening them, once for even choking out one of his workers because of a disagreement. There was no grace. Now, there were results. The father tended to get things done and was a leader in that regard, but his subordinates were terrified of him. Now, the son couldn't have been more different. The son didn't so much command as inspire. The son would never threaten his coworkers or his subordinates. The son was the type to risk himself, even for those who might not love him as much as he loved them. You could not have a bigger disparity between father and son as they went back and forth, between these two different leaders as they led throughout the 1980s and as they still echo today. Now, two magnetic personalities. They dominated our world and our television sets. They become the template for future leaders. Any guesses? All right. I'm talking, of course, about two leaders you know about. I'm talking about these two guys, two of the most iconic leaders of the 1980s. There we go. And it sinks in. If you don't know, I have questions about what you're doing with your life, but that's Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, probably, arguably, the two most famous leaders of the last 30 years because of the massive and beautiful and incredible universe that is Star Wars. And as incredibly ridiculous as this sounds, they are two perfect archetypes for two different ways we see people lead in the world. You've got Darth Vader, who's willing to choke and kill and hurt and maim and do whatever it takes as long as he gets his results. And you've got Luke Skywalker, would never ever hurt anybody, even sometimes when they deserve it. And we'll talk about what that looks like too. Now, our world is full of examples of the hard-driving Darth Vader leader type. And we see lots of these throughout our kind of public sphere. We see lots of these throughout our world time and time again. People who are willing to do whatever it takes to get things done. And so on TV, we have a fairly well-known chef named Gordon Ramsay. Some of you have heard of him. And he's become so famous for screaming at people, he's become his own meme because he's always making that face, right? Some of you watch reality TV. Some of you don't worry. He's angry, and he gets incredible results in the kitchen, but only because he has so much fear surrounding him, right? So we see hard-driving leaders on reality TV. We see it in politics. And so we could go through example after example, but this is Richard Nixon, famously kept guys around described as hatchet men. Chuck Colson was one of them. Chuck Colson, by the way, has had an incredible life change. You should just search it later, find out more about him. But Nixon keeps hatchet men around to deal with his political opponents, gets results, becomes president, but there's a lot of fear involved. Or what about this one? Some of you will recognize this guy. This is Coach Bob Knight. Probably the most celebrated. My little sister's a Tech fan, so she's loving this. There we go. Probably the most celebrated and awarded basketball coach of all time. I believe he has four times won the Coach of the Year award. He won an Olympic gold medal in coaching the basketball. He won 3 NCAA titles, 1 NIT tournament title, one of the most respected coaches of all time. But I'm guessing that when you think about Bob Knight, if you remember him, the first thing that steps up isn't all of those accolades. It's one of two stories. It's either the story of the time that he chucked a chair across the court at a ref, or the time he got fired for choking out one of his own players. This guy's an incredible basketball coach, maybe not as much of an incredible example or person. We see hard-driving leaders in the world, but we don't just see them out there in the world. We see them in our lives. And some of you have bosses who exemplify the hard-driving world of leadership, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get things done, even if you become kind of expendable in the process. And some of you know what it's like to sit across the table from a boss as they're looking at you and only seeing the numbers, and you know that you're only as good as what you can do for them. Some of you, this is what you grew up with, and your mother or your father come from the hard-driving school of leadership, and it was all about whatever you could do to improve or be the best, and your emotional health suffered. Some of you see this in politics, local or national, all over the place, people who exist and use other people for their own interests. We see hard-driving leaders all over the place. Now, it's not always fun to follow a hard-driving leader, but, it is kind of hard to dispute the results, right? This is why in America we tolerate leaders who do kind of horrible things, who do kind of brutal things because they get stuff done. And so, to quote Stalin, which this is the only time people quote Stalin, by the way, in America, if you want to make an omelet, you got to be ready to break some eggs. We see that as a justification for all sorts of ridiculous leadership behaviors or ridiculous behaviors from our leaders. Now, that's one opinion on leadership. That's the Darth Vader school of leadership. Get things done at all costs. The other side is a little softer. It's a little more fun. It's a little less results focused. And sometimes we see this and it gets a little different. We see these wishy-washy pictures of leadership, and it sounds like it's fun to work for until sometimes the business goes in a different direction, and the focus is so much on people feeling comfortable that sometimes the results aren't always what we hope for. We see pictures of this, and we see pictures of indecisive leaders who would never ever fire anybody, never ever even say a mean word to anyone, and so sometimes businesses start to spiral downhill, and the results aren't what they should be. And it sounds great until people start to lose their jobs and businesses start to go out of business. We see indecisive leaders and we get fear of what might happen if they were in charge of us. We dread the emergence, and the team's going to love this, we dread the reemergence of indecisive leaders who don't have a backbone. People like, and the best example is Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England in the 1930s, who was so spineless, who never stood up to Nazi Germany, that it actually led to World War II, whose lack of ability to do anything rough caused one of the greatest humanitarian calamities of all time. And the preaching team encouraged me to take that line out because I'd already been nerdy enough talking about Star Wars. So right now they're having some questions about my leadership. Maybe you are too. It's okay. See, the problem with this loving, gentle type of leadership is sometimes we question if it'll get things done. We question if it'll get the results, and we know the pain of not getting those. And so to flash back to Star Wars, even within the Star Wars universe, Luke's not the leader of the rebellion, that's Leia. And he's not the face of the franchise, that's Han. He's not even sometimes the hero. This guy who's so selfless sometimes gets upstaged by a robot that doesn't even speak English. Now, maybe you've dealt with soft leaders before, and they were nice to work with until everything kind of turned into chaos. And the company went downhill, and people lost jobs. Or it was at home with your family, and one of the parents wasn't willing to discipline at all, and kids get unruly when that happens. Or we see it in our world too. See, in America, we idolize the archetype of the hard-charging leader, the tough one who's willing to do whatever it takes to make things happen, even if that means running roughshod over the competition. See, often we pitch leadership as this dilemma, as this division between the willingness to do whatever it takes to get things done and the preference to care first for people before results. It's a choice, we might say, between results and kindness. And we're going to talk about that dilemma today because the Bible has a lot to say about it. Is it possible to lead so that we get things done, but also to lead with things that we prioritize, like grace and love? Now, this is a choice I honestly think that faces each of us, and I believe that all of us are called in places to act as leaders. Now, sometimes that's obvious, and maybe you're a leader at work, and your official title has something to do with the role of leading people and getting things done. Maybe that's your official work title. Maybe that's your official title at home, and it's mom or it's dad or it's grandma or it's you are in some way in charge of your family, and you are in charge of leading these people that you are entrusted with so that they might develop and grow. Maybe it's with your friends. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about friendship and how friends impact our lives more than anything else. You might be the friend that has the biggest impact over your circle of trust. You might be the one that others are following. For some of you, it's the kids that you babysit. And you're still a kid yourself, or at least you think of yourself that way, but you've got younger kids that look up to you. Kids in the neighborhood who look to see what you're doing. You're leading. Now, sometimes we have official places where we're leading, but some of us still don't fit into those categories. But here's where this hits every single one of us. We believe as a church that every single one of us, every single one of you, have a solemn and sacred duty, and that's to lead people to Christ. Not in some grand evangelistic crusade where we stand on the street corners and scream, but instead, little by little, by modeling our life in such a way that other people want to know our God. We believe this is how God made us to be. We believe this is the role that we're called to play, to lead people to the God who loves us. So no matter where you are on this spectrum, leadership matters. Organizations rise and fall on their leaders. That's true for businesses. It's true for companies. It's also true for churches. One of the things that first impressed me most about this church was I met people who led with love and passion because they loved this church. People who were willing to do whatever it took to live out their faith for their neighbors. People who loved this church with everything they have. The success of a movement rises and falls often on its leadership. What does that mean for the church? How do we choose how we'll lead? Now, we're going to talk about that today, and for some wisdom on this, we're going to look back at the book of Proverbs. If you've been here for the last couple weeks, that's not a surprise. Proverbs is this book of wisdom in the heart of the Old Testament. A lot of it is written by a guy named Solomon. We know him as King Solomon. He was a king of Israel in the 10th century, and he was both wise, but also a pretty big leader. See, Solomon reigned over Israel in the 10th century BC when Israel was at the height of its political and religious and economic power. They were trading with faraway nations. They were building their temple, and they were thriving militarily, which means that Solomon acts at the same time as CEO of a commercial enterprise, as religious leader, maybe pope, and as head of state. Solomon experiences leadership at all these different levels and has some things to say about it. Now, we're going to look at what he has to say today because we have a purpose behind that. My hope is not that you're just going to learn something interesting. Like, that's great, but that's what Wikipedia is for. My goal is that you're going to apply one of these things. With the kids you babysit, with the life group that you lead, with your children, with your coworkers. That one of these things is going to be something that you can take home and use this week. That's the goal. So the first lesson that we're going to look at is about vision. This is Proverbs 29:18. When there's no vision, people get out of control. Whoever obeys instruction is happy. You know, when I learned this, I learned it like many of you did, the King James Version. Where there's no vision, people perish. See, the first role of a leader is to point everybody to where we're going. If things are a movement, and the church at least is, if this is a movement that's going in a direction, the leader's job is to stand up and say, that's where we're headed. That's who we're called to be. That's what we believe we're supposed to be. Sometimes this is called a vision statement or a mission, preferential option in the future. It all boils down to this. That's where we need to be soon. We have a vision at Tonganoxie United Methodist Church. Many of you know this. It's just become part of who you are. We are a church that is all about inviting, connecting, growing, and serving. We believe, as a church, that's who God makes us to be. That's who God is calling us to be. And many of you as leaders stand up again and again in meetings, on Sunday mornings, and your job is to remind people that God has put this vision in our heart as a church, that we might invite and connect and grow and serve, that as a church we might always be chasing after those things because that's who God made for us to become. And as an aside, that's a pretty beautiful vision. And it's another one of those things that I first fell in love with when I came to this church. Because it's a picture of a church that cares not just for itself. A picture of a church that doesn't just exist to serve its own members or serve its own needs, but instead a church that is inviting people outside, looking for who's not here yet, connecting with them, growing together, serving each other and the world. That's who God wants us to be. And the job of each of you as leaders is to always be remembering and always be pointing in that direction. Now, vision's a good start, but vision isn't enough. It doesn't matter where your words are pointing if your life is heading a different direction. And so that brings us to Proverbs 16, 12 to 13. Kings detest wicked deeds, for their thrones are founded on righteousness. Kings favor those with righteous lips, and they love words of integrity. Now, far be it from me to disagree with the Bible, but I think I'm going to disagree with the Bible here. Is that okay? Here's why. If you look throughout history, that's not always the truest thing. See, kings don't always seem to love people who live with integrity. We look at picture after picture in history of kings who surround themselves with people who are liars and deceivers and sycophants, people who are willing to say whatever is necessary to make the king happy. We see people who don't have righteous lips, but instead they're willing to do whatever it takes to flatter a king's ego. I don't know if I agree with this proverb, except that I think the proverb is doing something else here. See, Solomon knew that kings weren't always surrounded by righteous people. He knew it because 2 kings before him was a king named Saul that was pretty famous for surrounding himself with terrible people, for surrounding himself with people who would tell him whatever he wanted to hear. Solomon knew that. This isn't Solomon sitting here talking about this is always what it looks like. This isn't a history of monarchy. I think instead Solomon's saying this is what it's supposed to look like. This is what it needs to look like if you want it to work. See, when you lead, your lessons become public. And we see that on the news, but we also see it in our lives. The people that are out front, everybody sees what they're doing. And what we do doesn't stay hidden. You can try to get people to go in one direction that you're not going yourself, to point the vision one way and to lead a different way. But for those of you who are leaders, that won't work for very long, will it? You can't lead someone to a place that you're not going yourself. To lead people higher, you've got to take the high road. Next week, we're going to talk about character and what it means to live out everything you believe and to embody it with every moment you have. But it doesn't matter where you're pointing. It matters where your life is leading. And that brings us to the third and most important point. Because it's not enough to have a vision and to live it out if the vision's no good. See, throughout history, we've seen pictures of people that lived out their visions, and their visions were terrible. We look at some of the great bad guys of history, Hitler, Stalin, they lived out exactly what they believed, and it was a nightmare. Solomon talks about this, Proverbs 20:28. Kindness and faithfulness protect the king. He supports his throne by kindness. The thing about kindness is, leaders don't have to do it, do they? I mean, not just kings. We're talking about kings here because the ancient world had monarchies. We don't have a king, but we have CEOs, and no one can tell them what to do, right? They don't have to be kind. We looked at examples earlier of leaders, and they were particularly unkind. People who can yell and scream and choke out players and get away with it. Kindness doesn't seem to be the character of a modern leader. But Solomon, in all his wisdom, seems to say that it's a good idea. Not that just it's a nice idea, but that it's an effective idea. Kindness leads to influence. And even though leaders are not forced to live it, they're wise to do so. Now, this is the part where a lot of you are probably starting to fall away on this, because that seems kind of weak, right? I mean, this seems like one of those things that you're expecting to hear in church, that when you go back to the boardroom or you go back to your small business or you go back to your house, that you're supposed to be really, really kind to the people that follow you. And that sounds like the type of thing that works really, really well in church, but not so much in cutthroat corporate America or in the small business world or in the military or wherever you lead. Of course I'm supposed to say that. And that's a fair point, but I kindly want to disagree with you. And here's why. This first picture is a guy named Ming Tan. He was hired by Google, the company that runs everything that you do. He was hired by Google as a software engineer, and he's a brilliant software engineer. He won the state championship of Singapore when he was younger. He was hired as employee number 107 as a software developer at Google, and he's a brilliant software developer. He's a brilliant software engineer. But if you were to meet him today, his most recent business card from Google doesn't say developer or software engineer, code writer, systems manager, any one of those techie terms that I should have checked with Kevin to make sure those all sound relevant. No? Okay, that's all right. He's not in code anymore. See, they moved him over from writing software to recently where now his job description says jolly good fellow, which is a weird term. But it's the closest they could get for a guy whose sole job at Google was to teach people about what they call emotional intelligence. We call it kindness. His job was to train engineers, software people who have tangible results, to be more loving and kind and thoughtful when they interact with their coworkers. Now, either that means that he wasn't very good at writing software, or it means that this was more important to a software company than software itself. And when you look at his accolades, I'm pretty sure it's the latter. See, Google exists off of its code. It's only as valuable as its code, and yet to them, it was more important to have one of their top engineers teach other people how to be kind at work than it was to have one more genius coder. And by the way, his nonprofit that he launched has been nominated 8 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's pretty good at what he does. What about this one? Another example. This is Herb Kelleher. Some of you recognize him, CEO of Southwest Airlines, the airline that you actually want to fly right now. He would encourage his employees to be playful at work. He was famous for joking around and having a good time, even in the board meeting. One of his official photos, this is him sticking out his tongue. Not very presidential CEO level, right? I mean, he's famous for being a bit of a maverick, for teaching people that it's okay to enjoy work. He's less famous, but perhaps more well-loved for his habit of hanging out in Love Field, the parking lot, waiting for some of his employees, pilots and stewards, as they get back from late, long flights, and they've been on their feet all day and they're exhausted, and he'd meet them at the baggage claim. And he'd grab their bags and just walk them to their car and say, thank you for everything you do, for these people that work for him, that he doesn't even need to know their names, but he wants to be kind and serve them. And he built a culture of radical hospitality and radical love and incredible loyalty to where his airline outperformed all others year after year after year. Kindness. It doesn't just make a happy workplace, it makes an effective one. Or what about the military? I mean, surely if there's any place where it's okay to be results-oriented, surely it's there, right? I mean, the results often in the military are the difference between life and death. And so surely if there's a place where kindness can be quietly swept under the rug, it's there, except in the 1980s, the U.S. Navy, sorry, Carl, I got it with the Navy on here. I found the article first. The U.S. Navy commissioned a paper, and they wanted to know what made a good leader. And so they took all of these objective measures, and they crunched them, and they got rid of all of the soft stuff, all of the people stuff, and just looked at what makes somebody more effective in a leadership capacity in the military. And they came down to two words: nice and warm. And I gotta say, living this close to Fort Leavenworth, I've been fortunate to meet more and more leaders from our military. And that personifies a lot of the leaders, not this hard-driving drill sergeant image that I grew up with, but instead, the people that I know now are nice and they're warm. And because of that, people want to follow them, even into places where their life might be threatened. Kindness is biblical wisdom for leadership. It's not just a smart way to lead, though it is that. It's how God calls us to lead. I want you to be kind to the people you lead. Whether that's your kids, your coworkers, people that you babysit, your neighbors down the street, the life group that you lead here. And I want to start you on this. And so I'm going to ask you, I want you to picture somebody that you lead. Any one of those, somebody that you lead. It might be somebody that looks up to you, little brother or sister, somebody that you care for. Picture their face in your mind. Close your eyes. I'm going to ask you to pray this prayer with me for them. Let's pray. God, help me be kind to this person. Help me remember that they are human, just like me. That they are loved, like me. That you made them just like you made me. That, God, you love them just like you love me. God, help me remember they deserve respect and care. And that if I am to deserve to lead them, that I must set a vision for where they're called to go. That I must embody that vision with my life. And God, help me to be kind and to lead always with love. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.